The whisper came through the dressing room wall, carried on the particular stillness of a house that believes itself asleep. Leonora heard it the way you hear a clock stop, not the sound itself, but the absence that follows. She set down the candle she had been holding and stood quite still, her hand flat against the plaster, and listened to her husband speak another woman's name in the dark. He said it the way a man says a prayer he no longer believes in, but cannot stop his mouth from forming. He said it twice. And then the house was quiet again, and Leonora found she was counting the roses on the wallpaper border, which was something she did when she needed her face to belong to her again before anyone saw it. She did not weep. Weeping would have required that she was surprised, what she had not expected, and this she would carry a long time before she understood it, was the thing she felt next, which was not grief and not anger, but something more precise than either. The flat, clarifying sensation of a woman who has just been handed the final piece of a puzzle she had hoped, against all evidence, never to complete. She had suspected for 6 weeks. She had watched, because watching was the skill she had been born to, the way another woman might have been born to music or to beauty. She watched the way her husband's hands slowed when he opened certain letters, the way he sat at dinner and was not quite there, present the way a portrait is present, form without occupation. She had told herself there were 1,000 explanations. She had told herself this with the focused energy of a woman who knows she is telling herself something that is not true. Now she straightened. She picked the candle back up. The flame was entirely steady, because her hand was entirely steady, and she had learned at 12 years old in a house considerably colder than this one that a steady hand was worth more than any dowry. There was one more thing she had not yet told him. She was fairly certain she would not tell him now. Outside the great window of Ashford Park, the August night pressed like a warm hand against the glass. Somewhere below, the river moved. Somewhere north, toward the market town of Calwell, the harvest quarter sessions were a week away, which meant the stewards would arrive tomorrow to begin the accounting, and which meant that Leonora had exactly 7 days to decide what she intended to do with the information she had just received through a plaster wall at 1:30 in the morning. She set the candle on the windowsill and watched the flame. 7 days. She had survived on less. Her name was Leonora Vane, Ashford now, by 3 months of marriage, and she was 26, and she had a face that people forgot in a room and remembered later when they were trying to understand something that had puzzled them. Her mother had called it a thinking face. The housemaids at Ashford Park had not yet called it anything to her directly, but she had heard them through a kitchen doorway call it plain and cold, and quietly agreed that the Duke had done rather worse than he might have. She had filed this away without letting it alter her expression. She had a great deal of practice at that particular skill. The Duke of Ashford was called Edmund. He was 31, and he was broad in the shoulder in the way that surprised people who expected a duke to have a decorative frame, and he had gray eyes that very rarely moved quickly, and hands that were rough at the knuckle in a way that suggested he used them for more than writing letters. He had married her in May for reasons that had never quite been made explicit, though her uncle had come away from the negotiation in the manner of a man who has been handed something he did not deserve and is anxious not to examine it too closely. Edmund had been, in the months since, consistently courteous. He had been considerate. He had been, in every material way, a man one could not fault. And he had been, in every way that mattered, elsewhere. The woman whose name he spoke in his sleep was called Isabel. Leonora knew this because she knew everything about Ashford Park that could be learned by a woman who moved quietly and was assumed, by most of the people in it, to be not particularly there. She began, on the morning after, to make her arrangements. She was careful. She had no intention of being anything else. She came down to breakfast at the usual hour and ate the usual amount, and answered Edmund's inquiries about her health with the usual composed brevity, and she thought, "He doesn't know that I know." And then she thought, "And what precisely does he know?" She turned this question in her hands for the rest of the morning while she sat with Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, reviewing the store accounts that nobody had properly reviewed since the previous Duchess had declined into her last illness 18 months prior. The accounts were a considerable mess. Leonora did not say this. She began, with great quietness, to set them right. It was Mrs. Holt who first looked at her sidelong over the ledger books and said, with the manner of a woman announcing something she has been carrying for some time, "You have the head for figures, Your Grace." The previous lady did not trouble herself with it. "I was raised to trouble myself with a great many things," Leonora said, turning a page. "What is this entry here, iron goods, November, a sum that does not correspond to any invoice I can find?" Mrs. Holt looked at the entry. Something moved in the housekeeper's face that was not quite readable. "I couldn't say, Your Grace. That would have gone through Mr. Corvin." Mr. Corvin was the estate steward. He had been Edmund's man of business for 9 years, since before Edmund had come into the title. He was 53, precise in dress, immaculate in manner, and had a way of speaking in the gentlest voice in any room, as though the information he was delivering was too delicate to be set down hard. He had received Leonora, when she arrived at Ashford in May, with a warmth she had recognized immediately as its own variety of management, the warmth of a man who has decided to incorporate you into his system rather than oppose you, because opposition attracts notice, and he preferred not to attract notice. She had filed this away, too. She put a small mark beside the November entry and turned to the December page. There were 11 more marks before she reached the end of March. That afternoon, Edmund found her in the library and stood in the doorway for a moment before she looked up, which was a habit of his she had catalogued early. He arrived in a room before he entered it and measured the temperature before he committed his weight to the threshold. He said her name in the way he always said it, carefully, as though handling something borrowed. "Mrs. Holt tells me you've been through the store accounts." "I have," Leonora said. She kept her finger on her place. "They've been irregular. They have." He came into the room properly then and stood at the other side of the table. His hands went to the back of a chair, and he looked at the stacked ledgers with an expression she had learned meant he was arriving at the edge of something he was not ready to say. "Corvin tells me there were some. Corvin has already spoken to you about it," she said. Not a question. A pause. "This morning." She held his gaze and held it pleasantly, which was the trick of it, and then she said, "What did he say the irregularities were?" Edmund's jaw did a thing it did when he was carefully arranging words. "Supply chain difficulties during the winter. Invoices lost in the transition after my mother's death." "I see," Leonora said. She closed the ledger. "Edmund, there is something I need to speak with you about, but not today. I ask only that when I do come to you, you allow me to lay the full matter before you draw any conclusion. I need you to promise me that." He looked at her for a long moment. The gray eyes moved, which was unusual. "What matter? I can't say yet. I need another 4 days." The silence held a particular quality. He was not a man who demanded things he was not owed, and he knew he was not owed an answer she had not finished finding. He said, "You have my word." She nodded and rose and went past him to the door, and she thought she heard him draw breath as though he meant to say something else. She paused. Leonora, his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, not the careful handling quality, but something underneath it, something slightly undefended. "Are you?" He stopped. "I am well," she said. "I am always well." And she went out. She was not entirely well, but that was between her and the child she was carrying, who was 8 weeks along by her best reckoning, and who had not been told yet about any of this, and who Leonora had decided she would protect as she had always protected herself, by knowing more than anyone expected her to know. Old Prue, who had been Leonora's nurse before she was her lady's maid, and who had been old for as long as Leonora could remember, said nothing that evening when she dressed Leonora's hair for dinner. She said nothing for a very long time, which was how Leonora knew she was about to say something. "There is a woman," Prue said, "who has been coming to the second lodge gate. I have heard her twice in a week. She does not stay long." Leonora kept her eyes on the mirror. "What does she look like?" "I did not see her. I heard the gate and saw a light moving away toward the Caldwell Road." A pause. Prue set down the brush with the careful quietness of long service. "I thought you should know." "Thank you," Leonora said. Prue's hands resumed their work. They were the hands of a woman who had dried a great many things without being asked, and said not a word about any of them, and Leonora thought, not for the first time, that there was not another person on earth she trusted with a fraction of the weight Prue carried without complaint. It was not Prue she sent to the second lodge gate the following evening. She went herself, wrapped in a dark cloak and carrying no light, because she had learned at 12 that you could walk through a great many dark spaces if you kept your breathing even and your eyes off the blackest parts. The woman at the gate was not what she had expected, and Leonora had expected a great deal. She was perhaps 8 and 30, fine-featured in the way of a woman who had been beautiful and who now looked at the world with an expression that had burned the prettiness away and left something more interesting. She was holding an envelope, and she startled when she saw Leonora, and then went very still. "You are not Edmund," the woman said. "No," Leonora agreed. "I am his wife." A long pause. The river said its quiet things in the dark. "I know who you are," the woman said at last. Her voice was even, but her hands adjusted the envelope, a fine, precise movement under stress. "I am Isabel Marsh. I have known Edmund since," she stopped. She tried again. "I have not come here for what you think." Leonora looked at her steadily. She was very good at looking at people steadily. It made them continue speaking when they had planned to stop. "He is in danger," Isabel Marsh said. "Not from me. From the man he trusts most, and trusts wrongly." She held out the envelope. "I did not know who else. I could not go to him directly, because Corvin watches who comes to the house and sends word to the men who I have been trying to find a way for 3 months." Her breath came a little harder. "I found it 2 nights ago, and then I found out there was a wife. And I hoped, Leonora took the envelope. It was sealed and old, and the wax had been broken and repressed. She looked at the broken seal and then at Isabel Marsh. "Tell me," Leonora said. "From the beginning." "I have time." What she learned in the next half hour at the gate, in the dark, while the river kept its counsel and the August heat lay over the fields like a held breath, was this. Corvin had been taking money from the Ashford estate for 7 years. Not taking it clumsily, not in a way that a cursory review would catch, but with the patience and precision of a man who understood that a ledger is only as honest as the person who has access to the invoices that support it. He had created suppliers that did not exist. He had duplicated legitimate entries in a second set of books and routed the difference through a cousin in Caldwell who held a wool factor's license. He had, 3 months ago, made an error. He had used Edmund's seal on a document he should not have had access to, authorizing a transfer that would only make sense if Edmund had known about the false suppliers. He had done this, Isobel believed, deliberately, not as a mistake. As insurance, and Isobel Marsh, who had known Edmund for 15 years, who had grown up 2 farms east of his mother's dower house, and who had been the first person to make him laugh after his father died, who had for many reasons, both good and sad, never become more than what she was to him, a friend. A keeper of his early self, a voice he trusted, had found out 3 months ago because Corvin's cousin had made the error of doing his wool-factor business in a tavern where Isobel's brother, a solicitor in Calwell, had been drinking quietly in a corner. The envelope contained a letter in Edmund's hand, written 4 years ago. It was a private letter, deeply so. It contained nothing criminal, but it was the sort of letter that, taken out of context, read in a certain light by certain people before certain witnesses, could be made to look like a man who had known for years about suppliers he was now claiming were invented without his knowledge. Corvin had a copy of it. The original had been obtained by Isobel's brother, who had purchased it at some cost from the cousin, who was beginning to be afraid. The harvest quarter sessions were in 6 days. Corvin intended to present Edmund's accounts there, under the new county magistrate, a man called Hartwell, who had taken the position in March, and who had already signaled he intended to make his mark by pursuing exactly this category of estate fraud. The presentation would include the document. Corvin's plan, as best Isobel could reconstruct it, was to produce Edmund's accounts as evidence of his own diligence and Edmund's culpability, collecting the credit for exposing the fraud while positioning himself as the innocent steward who had finally been forced to act. The false suppliers would be attributed to Edmund. The money would not be found, because Corvin had had 7 years to move it. Leonora stood at the gate in the warm dark and held the letter Edmund had written 4 years ago, and thought about the 11 marks she had made in the ledger margins, and thought about the November invoice for iron goods that corresponded to nothing. She thought about a man who never raised his voice and always arrived at the perfect warmth of calculated consideration. And she thought about 6 days, and about what could be done in 6 days by a woman who had been practicing invisibility her whole life, and who had therefore spent her whole life inside rooms that people believed to be unobserved. She folded the letter and put it in her cloak. "I will need your brother," she said. "I will need him in Calwell the day before the sessions. Can you get word to him?" Isobel Marsh looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a woman recalibrating something fundamental. "Yes," she said. "I can." "Then go," Leonora said. "Don't come to the house again. I'll send Prue to the Calwell Inn with a message when I need you." She walked back through the dark to the house with her breathing even and her eyes off the blackest parts, and when she arrived at her room, she sat at the writing table for a long time, with the candle burning, and thought through the problem from every side the way she thought through a column of figures, not looking for the answer she hoped was there, but for the one that was actually there. Then she began to write. The next 4 days were a study in economy of movement. She was at breakfast when she was expected, in the still room or the library at the hours she was known to favor, at dinner appropriately dressed and appropriately conversational. She asked Edmund, on the second morning, about the estate's wool contracts, with the manner of a woman who is making a general study of the property and has arrived at wool contracts the way she might arrive at anything else. He told her, watching her face with the attending quality he sometimes had, that the contracts ran through a factor in Calwell, a man called Beecham. She said she saw and ate her toast and noted that Edmund had just confirmed, without knowing he had confirmed it, that Corvin's cousin was operating under a false business name. On the third day, she sent Prue to Caldwell. On the fourth day, she sat down with a blank ledger sheet and, using only the information available in the Ashford store accounts and the estate's quarterly summaries going back 6 years, reconstructed what she believed Corvin had taken, line by line, with the false entries crossed against the legitimate ones and the discrepancies totaled per quarter. It came to a number that made her sit back in her chair for a moment. Then she copied it fair and put it with the letter and with 2 other documents she had found by the simple method of knowing what to look for: a receipt for iron goods signed by a man in a village 12 miles from Ashford who, when Prue's errand had been extended to include a quiet inquiry, was found to have no memory of the transaction and a firm recollection that he had never sold iron to anyone at Ashford Park in his life. She put all of it in the locked compartment of her writing case, which had been a gift from her mother and whose key she kept inside her left glove. On the 5th day, Edmund found her in the garden, which was where she went when she needed to think in the open air, and he stood for a while watching her look at the roses in the dry August light. She heard him coming because she always heard him coming. He had a particular weight of step, quiet but settled, that she had learned in 3 months the way you learn the rhythm of a house. She kept her eyes on the roses and waited. He said, "You said 4 days. I know. I needed 5. I have what I need now." He came to stand beside her and said nothing, and she thought about how this was one of the things she had noticed about him earliest, that he could be quiet without filling the quiet with himself, which was not common, and which she had not expected from a man with a duke's habit of being attended. She had thought about this more than was strictly sensible. "Tomorrow," she said, "I will come to your study tomorrow morning and lay everything before you. I need you to have Mr. Hartwell there." A pause. "The magistrate?" "Yes, Leonora." His voice had that undertone again, the undefended one. "What have you found?" She turned and looked at him fully, which she did not often do in a deliberate way, because she had found it did something to her composure that she had not yet resolved. He was looking back at her, with the gray eyes very still and very close. "Edmund, I need you to keep the promise you made me. What I have found implicates someone you trust, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide what to believe. Can you do that?" The pause was long enough that she counted the roses at the edge of her vision. "Yes," he said. She nodded and rose and went past him to the door, and she went inside. She had a great deal to do before 9 o'clock tomorrow. She was up before the birds, which was saying something in August, and she had everything laid out on Edmund's desk by 8:15. The reconstructed ledger, the false receipt, the iron goods entries with their margins marked, the letter and one other item she had not mentioned to anyone, which she had found in the last hour of the previous night in the estate's oldest deed box, tucked between 2 documents that nobody had had reason to touch in a long time. This item was a bill of sale made out in Corvin's cousin's true name, not the wool factor's license name, and signed by Corvin himself, 9 years old, for a property in the village of Stoke Carrow that appeared in the deed box, because it had once been Ashford land and had been sold in what the records described as an emergency liquidation during the previous duke's illness. The property had been sold for significantly less than its value. The buyer was Corvin's cousin. The signature was Corvin's. Corvin had been at Ashford for 9 years. She thought about the kindest voice in the room and what it had covered for 9 years. And then she thought about what she was going to do with that information. And then she thought, with great care, about how to be fair, because fairness was not what she wanted right now, but it was what she intended. They came at 9 o'clock, Edmund first, then Hartwell, a lean, methodical man of 50, who smelled of pipe tobacco, and looked at the ledgers on the desk with the eyes of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of morning. Then Mrs. Holt, who stood just inside the door with her hands folded and an expression that said she was not surprised and had not been surprised for some time. Then, last, shown in by Prue, who stood at the door and closed it behind him with the manner of someone planting a flag, Isabel Marsh's brother, a solicitor named Arthur Marsh, who carried a satchel and who set it on the table and opened it without preamble. Corvin was sent for. He arrived in 3 minutes, which meant he had been expecting the summons and had used the 3 minutes to set his face into its habitual expression of grave and patient service. He looked at the assembled company and performed the precise social calculation that a man of his particular experience performs in that moment, and he settled on Edmund. "Your Grace," he said, with a gentle voice. "Is there something I can help clarify?" Edmund said nothing. He was looking at the desk. Leonora had not sat down. She stood beside the desk and looked at Corvin with the unhurried attention of a woman who has been looking at this particular problem for 5 days and has resolved it to her satisfaction. "Mr. Corvin," she said, "I would like to show you something." She held up the first ledger sheet, the reconstructed accounts, the false entries ringed in ink, the quarterly totals. She held it so that Hartwell could see it from where he stood. Corvin looked at it. His expression did not change. "I'm not sure I follow, Your Grace. These are the store accounts from the past 6 years, Leonora said. Annotated to show entries for which no supporting invoice exists in the Ashford records, and cross-referenced against the estate's quarterly supply summaries. The discrepancy over 6 years comes to," she turned the page, "this figure. Mr. Hartwell, can you see the total?" Hartwell stepped forward and read the number. He said it aloud in the room without inflection. Corvin said, "There will be a simple explanation." "Winter supply chains, yes," Leonora said. "You told my husband there were supply chain difficulties. Invoices lost in my mother-in-law's illness. I went to find the invoices." She produced the false receipt, the iron goods, the signed name. This one, for instance. A receipt signed by a Mr. Tobias Fell of Martin Village for iron goods delivered to Ashford Park in November of last year. "Mr. Marsh, would you share what Mr. Fell told you?" Arthur Marsh opened his satchel. He produced a sworn statement and handed it to Hartwell. "Mr. Fell has attested that he sold no goods to Ashford Park in November of last year or any other year, that he cannot account for the existence of this receipt, and that his signature on this document does not match his signature." He produced a second paper. He provided a signed exemplar for comparison. Hartwell held the 2 papers to the light from the window and did not speak for a long moment. In that silence, the room was very still. A bird began and stopped outside. Light moved across the floor in a slow strip. Corvin said quietly, "These are very serious accusations, Your Grace. I have served this family for 9 years. And there is something else," Leonora said. She lifted the deed box document. "A bill of sale, 9 years old, for property in Stoke Carrow, sold under your instruction at a significant loss to a buyer named William Grange." "Mr. Marsh, William Grange is the legal name of the person trading as Beecham Wool Factors in Calwell," Arthur Marsh said. He placed 3 documents side by side on the desk. These are the trading license, the bill of sale, and a sworn statement from Grange himself, obtained yesterday afternoon, in which he describes the arrangement in full and names the party who organized it. Corvin's face did something it had not done before. The muscles around his jaw shifted, and for a moment the gentle expression was simply not there, and what was there instead was something more human and considerably older and far more tired. His hands adjusted his coat at the lapel, a small, precise movement, and then were still. Mrs. Holt at the door was looking at the floor. Edmund had not moved. He stood at the window with his back to the room and his hands at his sides, and he was looking out at the garden. "Mr. Corvin," Hartwell said, in the voice of a man performing a function, "I am going to ask you one question, and I need you to consider your answer carefully." He held up the deed box document. "Did you sign this document?" The silence lasted long enough for the light to move another inch across the floor. Corvin said, "Yes, it was remarkable," Leonora would think later, how small the word was. One syllable, dropped into the room without ceremony, and 9 years of careful architecture coming apart behind it like ice in a warm hand. Corvin sat down in the chair beside the desk, which no one had offered him, and put his hands on his knees and looked at them. Mrs. Holt made a sound at the door that was not quite a breath. Edmund turned from the window. He looked at Corvin for a long moment, and Leonora looked at Edmund's face and understood something she had not expected to understand today, that he was not angry. He was grieving. Corvin had been with him since before the title, since the early years when Edmund had been learning what it meant to inherit a burden rather than a legacy, and whatever Corvin was, he had also been, for 9 years, a known presence in a life that had not always had many. The loss of that, the loss of a face you had trusted at your table for 9 years, was a different order of pain from the financial one, and Edmund was not a man who could hide which pain he was feeling. He said, very quietly, "Why?" Corvin looked up. His face had a quality now that Leonora recognized as genuine, the quality of a man who has been caught not at the end of his planning, but at the end of his endurance, and who is, in some part of himself, relieved the Stoke-Caro sale, Corvin said. "Your father's orders. He sold the property for a fraction of its worth to cover a debt he did not wish recorded, and I was the instrument of it, and I told myself for a year that I would be repaid. When I was not, he stopped. He looked at his hands again. It became a different kind of accounting. Edmund said nothing. The room held the weight of that. Leonora looked at Hartwell. She said, "Mr. Hartwell, what I ask, on behalf of the Duke, is this. The full accounting Mr. Marsh has brought will be provided to you and to the Sessions. The amount owed to the estate will be made clear. What I ask is that the matter of criminal prosecution be considered against the fact that Mr. Corvin has a sister in Devizes, widowed with 3 children, who has no other resource." She paused. The estate does not need a public prosecution. It needs the money. And it needs Corvin gone. Both of those can be accomplished without standing him before an assize judge if he cooperates fully with Mr. Marsh's accounting and signs a full confession today. Hartwell looked at Edmund. Edmund said, without turning from the window, "What my wife has described is what I want." Corvin looked at Leonora. The tired look on his face deepened into something that was not quite admiration and was not quite shame, but existed somewhere between them. He said, "You found all of this in 5 days." "I found the starting point in the first 3 hours," she said. "The rest was simply following the thread." She kept her voice even. "Your cousin, I think, has been hoping to be caught for some time. He will be grateful for a confession that settles the matter quietly." A long pause. "Yes," Corvin said. "I expect he will." He signed everything Arthur Marsh put before him. He did it with the neat, precise signature of a man who had spent 9 years being meticulous, and when it was done he stood and straightened his coat and looked at Edmund once, and Edmund looked back at him. And something passed between them that Leonora did not entirely understand, but chose not to examine, because there are some things that belong only to the people who carry them. Mrs. Holt showed Corvin out. The door closed. Hartwell spent a quarter-hour with the documents, and then departed with the manner of a man who has found the day more interesting than he expected, and has the good taste not to say so. Arthur Marsh packed his satchel and paused at the door and said, to the room in general, that his sister sent her regards, and then he went. Edmund and Leonora were alone in the study for the first time. He stood at the window still, and she stood at the desk, and the morning light came in and fell between them on the cleared surface where the papers had been. He was looking at the garden. She was looking at his hands, which were still at his sides and very quiet, and she thought about a man who expressed feeling through the stillness of a body that wanted to move, and she thought she understood that particular strategy rather well. He said, "You knew about this before you came to me." I suspected. I needed to be certain before I put the accusation before you. I said I would lay the full matter out. You spent 5 days while he was still in the house gathering evidence alone. Yes. A pause. He turned from the window and looked at her, and the gray eyes were not still this time. They were doing something she had not seen before. Why did you not come to me sooner? She held his gaze. Because I needed to be certain you would believe me. Corvin has been here 9 years, and I have been here 3 months. And I needed. She stopped. She decided, because she had decided to be fair, to finish the sentence honestly. I needed to know whether I was going to take that evidence and use it, or whether I was going to take myself and go. The room was very quiet. Go, he repeated. Not a question, but not quite a statement. I have the means to manage independently. I would not have been destitute. She kept her voice matter-of-fact, because the matter-of-fact register was the one that held, and because what she was about to say was the most important thing she had said in 5 days, and she needed it to land with its proper weight. I heard you say her name in your sleep. In August, 3 weeks ago. His face did not change, but his hands changed. The left one opened slightly at his side. She said, I am not saying this as a grievance. I am saying it because it is the truth of what I knew when I was deciding. I needed to know which choice was mine to make freely, without debts in either direction. And I want you to know that I know. A pause. I believe Isobel Marsh to be a good woman and a loyal friend to you, and I have no quarrel with her. Edmund crossed the room. He did not hurry and he did not hesitate. He came across the study floor in the same settled, quiet way he moved through every space, and he stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her face for a long time, with an expression she could not immediately classify, which was unusual, because she could generally classify expressions. He said, she was a friend. She has been a friend for 15 years. When Helena died, he stopped. He tried again. When my first wife died, Isabel, she was the person who told me what Helena had actually been suffering, because Helena had not told me, and I had not known, and I was. He stopped again. A muscle in his jaw worked. I say her name in my sleep because I am dreaming about a conversation we had the week after Helena died, in which she told me there was nothing I could have done differently, and I am still, apparently, trying to believe that. Leonora stood very still. She thought about the grief-armored gravity of him, and the working hands that surprised people, and the way he stood at the edge of rooms before he committed to entering them. And she thought about a man who has been carrying a specific weight for 18 months, and who has never once in 3 months of marriage given her the chance to see it. She said, You should have told me. I know. Flat, undefended, I know. I was. He looked at the desk. I had decided that it was not fair to bring you into a house that was still in mourning, and so you decided alone who could bear what." He looked at her. A long pause. Something shifted in the room. "Yes," he said. Very quiet. The same quality as Corvin's yes, the same single syllable dropped without ceremony, but an entirely different species of relief behind it. She said, "I have something to tell you as well." She folded her hands. "I am with child. 8 weeks, by my reckoning. I had intended to tell you before I found out about Corvin, and then I wasn't sure I would tell you at all, and then I spent 5 days being rather certain I would manage the matter independently. But," she met his eyes, "I would prefer to tell you. I find I would prefer a great many things I had not planned to prefer." Edmund said nothing for a moment. His hands had gone to his sides again, but differently this time, not contained, but resting, as though the containing had stopped being necessary. He said, "Leonora." And then he said her name again, in a different register than she had ever heard him say it, and she understood, with the precise observational faculty that was her particular gift, that she was hearing for the first time how he had always meant it. He said, "I have no right to ask anything of you on the basis of this morning." "No," she agreed. "You don't." "Marry me," he said, and then caught himself, a flicker of something wry crossing his face that she had never seen before. "We are already married. I am aware of that. You are doing this rather badly," she said. "I know, I've been told." The wry flicker became, astonishingly, a real one, a real, self-aware, helpless shadow of humor at his own expense, brief and entirely unguarded, and Leonora felt something in her chest that she had been keeping strictly organized begin to come apart at its edges. He said, "What I mean is, stay, choose it. Because you wish it. That is the only reason I will take." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring not what she hoped was there, but what was actually there. And what was actually there, in the gray eyes, steady and quiet and undefended for the first time in 3 months, was something she had suspected under all the careful courtesy, but had not let herself look at directly. She said, "I already know more about your estate than you do. Considerably more," he agreed. "And I have opinions about the accounts." I gathered. And I intend to be. She considered the word present in this house, in a way that may discompose people who have grown accustomed to not being observed. "Good," he said, simply, with a feeling she had not expected to hear from him this plainly. She said, "Then yes." Outside the window, the August light moved across the garden, and the bird that had started earlier began again in the roses, and it was the same bird she had been hearing since May, the same particular phrase, 3 notes repeated with patience and without argument, and she thought she would remember that sound for a long time. Old Prue wept at the wedding, which she announced was entirely involuntary and nothing to do with sentiment, and which was a brief and quiet affair in the parish church on a morning in October when the leaves had just turned and the air smelled of wood smoke and change. Edmund's old university friend Caro came and behaved with grave decorum until the register was signed, at which point he embraced Edmund with the enthusiasm of a man who has been watching his friend for some time and is extremely glad to stop worrying. "Mrs." Holt pressed Leonora's hand at the church door and said, "With the economy of a woman who does not use words lightly, we are glad, Your Grace." Arthur Marsh was there as a matter of practical friendship, and he brought Isobel. And Isobel and Leonora stood briefly beside each other after the ceremony and looked at the churchyard for a moment in companionable silence. "He is not good at asking for help," Isobel said finally. "I know," Leonora said. "I have some experience with that in myself." Isobel smiled. It was the smile of a woman who has watched a friend be saved and is grateful without reservation. Take care of him. He is worth taking care of. I am aware, Leonora said, and went to find her husband. Corvin went to his sister in Devizes, as had been arranged, and was not heard from publicly in the matter. Mrs. Holt took on the management of certain accounts previously under his supervision, and proved, as Leonora had suspected she would, to have been doing half the actual work for years anyway. Arthur Marsh was retained as the estate's solicitor in Calwell, and took a very favorable view of the arrangement. William Grange, Corvin's cousin, cooperated so fully with the accounting that by Christmas the settlement was resolved and a figure had been agreed. The iron goods man in Martin Village, Tobias Fell, received a letter of formal apology from the Ashford estate and a small consideration for his trouble, which he framed on the wall of his shop and showed to everyone who came in for a period of approximately 3 years. The county wager book at the Calwell Inn, which had opened a line on the subject of whether the new Duchess would last the season, was quietly closed with no winner declared. The redeemable rival, which was the Ashford set's name for the immaculate cousin who had made the early running at Leonora, and then recanted sharply when the truth of the situation became clear, came to Edmund in December and apologized in the clean, honest manner of a man who has decided that dignity is better than performance, and was received with enough warmth that he came to dinner at Easter, and has since been observed to treat Leonora with the genuine respect one accords to someone who has proved their quality in circumstances where quality was required. The child was born the following May, a girl, which was not what anyone except Leonora had expected, and who had from the first week the gray eyes and the settled, considering quality that suggested she was measuring every room she was brought into before she committed to occupying it. Edmund held her with the careful hands of a man holding something irreplaceable, and Prue said the baby had her mother's face, and Edmund said he hoped not, for the child's sake. At which point Leonora turned from the window where she had been sitting in the early morning light and said, "That is the worst thing anyone has said to me in 11 months, and I include the man who accused me of fraud in front of a magistrate." "I am saying it is a face that is kept too much to yourself," Edmund said. "That is all I have ever meant by it." She looked at him across the room in the May morning, with the light coming in the way it came in May, clear and new and without the weight of the months behind it, and she thought about a year ago, almost exactly, when she had stood in a dressing room with her hand flat against the plaster and counted roses. The counting had been the wrong accounting. She had been measuring the distance to something she had already passed. She said, "You said that rather well." "I have been practicing," he said. "You are a demanding audience." "I know," she said. "It is one of the things I intend to keep." Outside, in the garden, the bird began again, 3 notes, patient and repeated, the same phrase it had been offering all along, which she had been hearing since the morning she arrived at Ashford Park in May of the previous year, and which she now knew she would keep, the sound of it, filed with the things that matter more than you know they matter, until the morning you do know. The roses were open. The light was even. And in the great house that had spent 9 years keeping a silence that needed to be broken, someone was keeping accounts at last. If this story warmed you, if you have ever stayed in a room and done the difficult, quiet work of staying, rather than the easier work of leaving, then you know what Leonora knew at that window. Some proofs can only be made in the light, before witnesses, with the object held open in your hands. Come and sit by this fire when you need to remember that. The kettle is on, the chair is kept, and there are more stories waiting here that cost something to tell and are worth every penny. If you would like to keep your place by the hearth, subscribe. 1 click and you will not miss the next one. Tell me, in the letters below, what would you have done at the gate in the dark, with the envelope in your hands and the choice not yet made. Sleep well and be honest with the ones who kept your lamp burning. They know, even when you don't tell them. They always know.